Hello, college biology. This is our second video on the basics of chemistry, and we're going to start with our subatomic particles. In our last video, we talked about elements, atoms, and the elements of life. Well, we're going to go deeper and talk about what atoms are composed of, the forces that are involved in the composition of atoms, and how they arrange themselves. So, we will start by talking about the three parts of an atom. Atoms are made of protons, neutrons, and electrons. These are all subatomic particles. Sub is a prefix meaning below, so these are the particles below atoms. So protons, neutrons, and electrons, and they have relative properties. First of all, there's the issue of mass. Protons have a mass of 1 atomic mass unit because they are approximately the same as neutrons, which have a mass of 1 atomic mass unit. Now electrons, you can see 5 times 10 to the negative 4. That negative 4 means this is a really small number. Electrons have negligible mass. So for the purposes of our class, we're just going to go ahead and say that electrons have no mass. Or if you want to say have approximately 0 mass, that's fine. Now, charges are a property of some of these particles as well. Protons have a charge of +1. They are positively charged. Neutrons, as their name suggests, are neutral and have no charge, and electrons have a charge of -1. And then there are regions in which they are found. Protons are found in the nucleus, neutrons are also found in the nucleus, clustered all together, and electrons are found in the shells around the nucleus. There is another property of these particles that I'd like to discuss that isn't mentioned here, and that is how they move. Protons and neutrons, though they are in the nucleus, they aren't stationary entirely. They do a little bit of vibration, right? They kind of shake up a little bit. They're not moving very much, but they are kind of shaking a little bit. Now the electrons, on the other hand, are entirely different. One, they move wildly, so their pattern of movement is not in the circle that is usually described here in the Bohr model. That's totally inaccurate. They do not travel in circular paths. They travel in like these wild, crazy, just really hard to determine paths. So they move wildly. Two, they move very quickly. So despite, the neutrons and the protons doing their little vibration, the electrons are actually zigzagging crazy at crazy speeds, and they don't stop. So the electrons are always doing their thing. They're always just being all over the place in that atom. And that's an important quality that we did not discuss. Another thing about these subatomic particles is that because they have charge, they are polar. So polarity is a term that refers to the presence of charge, and these particles have them, or some of them do. Protons are polar because they have a positive charge. Neutrons are nonpolar. They do not have a charge. And electrons are polar because they have a negative charge. So what does that mean? It means that these charges, these substances have to follow the rules of electromagnetism. And there are basically 3 rules for electromagnetism. They are like charges repel, opposite charges retract, and like dissolves like. So for like charges repel, that means if you have 2 substances with a positive charge, they have the same charge, they are going to push away from each other. If you have 2 particles with a negative charge, they have the same charge, so they're going to push away from each other. But if you have 2 particles of opposite charges, they're going to be attracted to each other. Now, the last rule, that like dissolves like, that we're not really ready to use that yet, but that is going to come up again later. That simply states that polar substances will dissolve with polar substances, nonpolar substances will dissolve with nonpolar substances, and polar and nonpolar will not mix together. So they have to follow these rules. So let's review. Atoms are made of subatomic particles. The 3 primary subatomic particles below atoms are protons, neutrons, and electrons. Protons have a positive charge, 1 atomic mass unit, and they vibrate in the nucleus. Neutrons have no charge. They have 1 atomic mass unit, and they vibrate in the nucleus. Electrons have a negative charge. They have ignorable mass, negligible mass, and they move wildly, they move quickly, and they never stop. Now, because charges are involved here, we have to discuss polarity, which is the presence of charge, and things that are polar follow the rules of electromagnetism, which state 1, opposite charges attract, like charges repel, like substances dissolve like substances, meaning Polar dissolves polar substances, nonpolar dissolves nonpolar substances, but nonpolar and polar substances do not dissolve. This last rule is going to come up later, but you can see in the atom, these rules are being applied right away. We're going to talk more about the model of the atom and how polarity and electromagnetism can explain that model. I hope this helps. Struggle well.